The courtroom was unusually quiet that day, the hum of nervous whispers in the air as people waited for the judge to take his seat. There were no loud debates, no objections, just the low murmur of anticipation. The case at hand was already complex enough, but no one could have predicted the twist that was about to change everything. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Everyone turned their heads, expecting the usual late arrivals or maybe an attorney making a grand entrance. But no one could have expected what happened next. Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood icon and legendary actor, walked into the courtroom. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Eyes widened, and even the most seasoned lawyers paused for a moment as if the earth had shifted beneath their feet. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood. What was he doing here, in the middle of a serious courtroom case? Clint's face was as steely as ever. He walked with the same silent confidence that had made him a household name for decades. The trademark squint, the quiet intensity, he looked every bit the man who had spent decades on the silver screen, facing down villains and winning impossible battles. But there was no script in this room, and Clint wasn't here to act. The judge, an older man named Judge Anderson, took a deep breath, adjusting his glasses as he stared down Clint. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, as if he found the whole situation amusing. "Well, well," Judge Anderson said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I never thought I'd see the day when Clint Eastwood walked into my courtroom. But I suppose even stars need to make appearances now and then." He chuckled under his breath, clearly not taking Clint seriously. Clint didn't respond. He simply made his way to the witness stand, his eyes focused straight ahead, unwavering. He was a man on a mission, and nothing seemed to faze him. The prosecutor, a young woman named Monica James, raised an eyebrow. She had heard rumors about Clint's involvement in government matters, but this was the last place she expected him to be. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud thump on the table, as Judge Anderson knocked his gavel. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge continued, "I trust you're here to share your thoughts on the matter at hand. But I do hope you're aware that this isn't one of your movie sets. We run a tight ship here. And unless you have something of actual value to offer, you're going to find yourself just another name on the witness list." Clint didn't flinch. He stood still, the weight of the room pressing in on him, but his presence remained unshaken. He had faced down far tougher situations in his career, both in front of the camera and behind the scenes. Judge Anderson's words hung in the air, but Clint wasn't fazed. He was here to do more than just testify. He was here to reveal a truth that no one in this room was prepared for. Suddenly, Clint reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming badge. The glint of metal caught the light as he carefully placed it on the table in front of him. It was simple, almost ordinary, but it carried weight that no one in the room could have anticipated. The U.S. Secret Service badge gleamed in front of everyone, causing an immediate shift in the energy of the room. Judge Anderson froze. His smirk evaporated, replaced by an expression of surprise that quickly morphed into one of uncertainty. Monica James looked from the badge to Clint, her professional demeanor now slipping into confusion. The murmurs in the courtroom quieted, replaced by an air of disbelief. What is this?" Judge Anderson stammered. His usual confidence was now replaced with palpable discomfort. "Are you saying?" Clint met his eyes, the faintest hint of a smile appearing at the corners of his lips. "I'm saying that sometimes things are not as they appear," he said, his voice steady. "And that I'm not just here as an actor. I'm here as someone who has served this country, protecting it from threats you might never even hear about." The room was silent. The weight of Clint's words settled on everyone in the room like a heavy fog. No one had expected this, least of all the judge, who had made light of Clint's appearance moments earlier. Clint leaned forward slightly, his tone growing more serious. "I'm not here for a photo op. I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here because this case, this situation, this is bigger than any of us. And I'm here to make sure the truth comes out." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. So, you're saying this case has national security implications? What exactly are you involved in, Mr. Eastwood? Clint's gaze never wavered. I'm involved in the protection of this country. I've been involved in situations most of you wouldn't even believe, and I'm telling you, this case. It's connected to something far more dangerous than anyone here realizes. A long pause hung in the air as the weight of Clint's words sank in. The judge cleared his throat, clearly rattled but trying to regain his composure. This is highly irregular, he muttered, glancing at the defense attorneys, who looked just as stunned as everyone else in the room. Clint didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket again, pulling out a folder that was neatly sealed. He slid it across the table, towards the judge. This is a dossier, Clint explained, his voice calm but firm. Inside are details about the true nature of this case. You'll find that it's not about a simple financial dispute or an innocuous corporate crime. This case is about a threat, one that could jeopardize the security of millions of people. You need to take it seriously. The room was utterly still. Even the court reporters, who had been typing away furiously, seemed to pause in their tracks, uncertain of how to proceed. No one had expected Clint Eastwood to walk into the room and turn it upside down, but that's exactly what he had done. Judge Anderson stared at the folder for a moment, clearly wrestling with the gravity of the situation. He finally looked up at Clint, his voice much quieter now. I never thought I'd see the day when Clint Eastwood would be the one to hand me classified information. But I suppose I've been wrong about a lot of things today. Clint stood up, his demeanor unchanged. It's not about me, Judge. It's about protecting what matters. He turned to the rest of the courtroom. You'll all see soon enough just how big this is. And when you do, you'll understand why I had to be here. With that, Clint turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind a room full of people who would never look at him, or the case, quite the same way again. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, and the silence that followed was deafening. Judge Anderson didn't move, still staring at the badge on the table, the implications of Clint Eastwood's presence in his courtroom slowly sinking in. One thing was certain, this was just the beginning of a far larger story, and Clint Eastwood had just set it into motion. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood had always been a figure larger than life, a man whose name carried weight both on and off the screen. To most people, he was the iconic actor who had graced the silver screen for decades, playing tough guys, heroes, and anti-heroes. His rugged features, steely eyes, and quiet intensity had made him one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood. But as Clint sat in that courtroom earlier, he was no longer just the Hollywood legend that people knew from films like Dirty Harry or The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He was something else entirely. Something far more important. The story of Clint Eastwood's involvement with the U.S. Secret Service began long before his famous roles in film. His life, though largely private, had been filled with moments that most people would never have guessed. A career built on playing characters who faced down dangerous criminals and larger-than-life villains was not so different from the real-life role Clint had quietly embraced in his personal life. The public had always admired Clint for his stoic demeanor, his unmatched charisma, and the way he could stand tall even in the face of danger. But what they didn't know was that Clint had been serving a different kind of role for much of his life, one that involved real, life-threatening situations. Clint Eastwood had joined the U.S. Secret Service in the mid-1980s, just a few years after finishing his work on some of his most famous films. While most people were consumed with his movie career, Clint had found a new calling, one that took him into the world of national security. He had initially kept his involvement quiet, just as he did everything else in his life. But the truth was, Clint wasn't just acting out fictional battles in the movies, he was involved in real-life ones, sometimes on the front lines. It had started when Clint was approached by an old acquaintance, someone from his past who had ties to high-level government agencies. At first, he was hesitant. Hollywood had always been his home, and his place in the spotlight was something he valued. But there was something about the way this man spoke that intrigued him, something that spoke to Clint's deep sense of patriotism and duty. It didn't take long for Clint to make the decision. He would step away from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood and step into a world that few knew about, a world of shadows, where secrets were kept and lives were on the line. For years, Clint's role as a Secret Service agent had remained classified. He carried out covert missions, protecting high-profile individuals, and dealing with threats that the average citizen would never even hear about. But for Clint, it was all just part of the job. He didn't need recognition or accolades for what he was doing. His love for the country and its people was enough. As the years passed, Clint continued his work with the Secret Service while simultaneously building his legacy in Hollywood. He never sought the limelight for his real-life exploits, choosing instead to remain in the background. But it wasn't an easy life. Being a member of the Secret Service meant constantly being in danger, constantly being on edge, and constantly keeping secrets. Now, sitting in that courtroom, Clint couldn't help but reflect on the path that had led him here. A life built on sacrifice and dedication, never truly being able to share the weight of the work he had done, except with a few trusted individuals. He had learned long ago that sometimes, doing the right thing meant walking away from the things that others valued. But today, things had changed. The case that had brought him into the courtroom wasn't just another assignment, it was something much bigger, something that could threaten everything he had worked for. That was why he had decided to speak out. Clint had always believed in the truth, and when he had seen how dangerous the situation had become, he knew he had to act. This wasn't just about a few criminals or a simple legal matter, it was about the safety of the entire nation. But none of that was something anyone in the courtroom could have known. They only saw Clint Eastwood, the actor. To them, he was the tough guy from Gran Torino and Unforgiven. They didn't know the real Clint, the one who had spent countless hours in dark rooms, tracking down threats to national security. They didn't know about the time he had narrowly escaped an attack while protecting a dignitary overseas or the countless close calls he had experienced while shadowing a potential threat. They didn't know that Clint Eastwood was not just an actor, but a man who had served his country in ways they could never fully understand. As Clint stood up from the witness stand, the weight of the room began to press on him. His part in this courtroom drama wasn't over yet, and the truth he had revealed was only the beginning. But as the judge and the rest of the people in the courtroom began to process the revelation about Clint's secret life, Clint knew one thing for certain: this case was about to change everything. Outside the courtroom, the world was already buzzing with questions. Who was Clint Eastwood really? What had he done in his role with the Secret Service? And most importantly, what did he know about the case that had just exploded in front of them? But Clint wasn't ready to give them the answers just yet. Not until the time was right. For now, all he had done was crack open the door to the truth, and he had no intention of letting anyone close it again. As Clint left the courtroom, he couldn't help but wonder what the coming days would bring. The legal battle ahead would be unlike anything he had ever faced. But he had faced far worse in his life, and he had always come out stronger on the other side. The road ahead was going to be dangerous, but Clint Eastwood had never been afraid of a challenge. The courtroom was buzzing with speculation after Clint Eastwood's revelation, but Clint wasn't there to entertain rumors or fuel the media frenzy. He knew that his next move would be just as critical as the last. What mattered now was getting the truth into the hands of the right people before it was too late. As Clint exited the courthouse, the heavy weight of the situation hung over him. The sun shone down on him as he walked to his car, but the brightness of the day did little to lift the gloom that had settled inside him. What had just unfolded wasn't some movie plot, it was real, and its implications were far more dangerous than anyone in the courtroom could understand. Clint had been involved in cases that spanned decades, ones that dealt with threats from all corners of the globe. But the case he had just revealed was like no other. It wasn't about some isolated group or a rogue criminal, it was a national security threat that reached the highest levels of power. And now, it had been dragged into the light. The dossier he had handed over to Judge Anderson was a carefully crafted document. It wasn't just a collection of facts, it was the tip of the iceberg. The real story lay beneath the surface, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right people to uncover it. The secrets contained in that file were powerful, and Clint knew that once the world got a glimpse of what was inside, there would be no turning back. The problem was, no one in the courtroom could even begin to comprehend the magnitude of what Clint had just revealed. They had no idea that this case was part of a much larger, much more complex operation that stretched across international borders, into government agencies, and, yes, even into the very heart of the legal system. The hidden ties that connected this case to national security were deep and far-reaching, and Clint knew that exposing them would put everything, and everyone, he had ever known in jeopardy. As Clint settled into the back seat of his car, the file sitting beside him on the leather seat, his mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. The events of the day had shaken him, but he wasn't about to let fear dictate his actions. Fear had no place in the world he now inhabited. This was about something bigger than himself. He had come too far to turn back now. The file that Clint had given to Judge Anderson was only the beginning. Inside, there were names, dates, and locations that tied this case to an operation that spanned the globe. There were details of covert meetings, coded messages, and operations that had never seen the light of day. Clint had seen it all firsthand. He had been in the rooms, had been on the ground, had felt the tension in the air when the world's most dangerous individuals moved in the shadows. And now, those secrets were about to come to light, whether anyone was ready or not. But Clint also knew that exposing the truth would come at a price. There were forces at play, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and power, that wouldn't let the secrets of this case be revealed without a fight. Clint had spent enough time in the shadows to know that the stakes were high, and the consequences for failure were severe. The file wasn't just a collection of documents. It was a roadmap to uncovering a conspiracy that could bring down powerful figures in government, business, and beyond. Clint's involvement in the case was no accident. He had been quietly working behind the scenes for years, tracking the movements of individuals whose actions posed a direct threat to the country's security. But Clint couldn't take down this network alone. He needed help, and that's where things were about to get tricky. The next few days were crucial. The clock was ticking, and Clint knew that once the truth was out, there would be no going back. He would have to rely on a select few to help him navigate the dangers that lay ahead. His first step was to contact someone he trusted, someone who could help him make sense of the information in the dossier. Clint pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Hey, it's Clint," he said when the line clicked. "I need you to meet me. I've got something big." The voice on the other end of the line was calm, but Clint could hear the concern beneath it. "What's going on, Clint? You sound serious." Clint paused for a moment, weighing his words carefully. "It's bigger than anything we've ever faced before. And I'm going to need your help to take it down." There was a brief silence on the other end before the voice spoke again. "All right. Where do you need me?" Clint exhaled slowly, relieved that he hadn't been met with immediate skepticism. The person on the other end of the line was someone Clint had worked with for years, a former agent who had gone on to become one of the most respected experts in national security. They had crossed paths on more than one covert operation, and Clint trusted them with his life. They were one of the few people who could understand the gravity of the situation. "I'll send you the details. We need to meet somewhere secure. Bring everything you've got, this is going to get ugly." After hanging up, Clint leaned back in the seat, his thoughts swirling. There was no way to know what the next few days would bring. The enemy was powerful, and their influence spread wide. But Clint had never backed down from a fight before, and he wasn't about to start now. He had a job to do, and he would see it through to the end. As he drove through the streets, Clint's mind returned to the dossier. He couldn't help but think of all the lives that were unknowingly connected to this case, people who had no idea that their fates were tied to the shadowy figures Clint had been tracking for years. The challenge ahead was monumental, but Clint was determined to make sure the truth came to light. It wasn't just about the mission anymore, it was about something deeper, something more personal. Clint had always believed in justice, in protecting the innocent, and in standing up for what was right. And now, that belief was going to be tested in ways he never could have imagined. The road ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: Clint Eastwood wasn't about to let this case slip through his fingers. Not now, not ever. Clint Eastwood's thoughts raced as he made his way to the meeting location. He had set up a secure rendezvous with his former colleague, a man he had worked with during his time in the U.S. Secret Service. In the world of covert operations, trust was everything, and Clint knew he could rely on this person. They had been through too much together to be swayed by fear or doubt. The location was a quiet, out-of-the-way diner on the outskirts of town, tucked between a gas station and a rundown motel. On the surface, it seemed like the last place anyone would go for an important meeting. But for those in the know, it was a perfect spot, low profile, discreet, and almost always empty. No one would expect anything of significance to happen here. Clint parked his car in the back lot, making sure to keep an eye on his surroundings. He had learned long ago to never let his guard down, even in seemingly harmless settings. The world had a way of turning upside down when least expected, and Clint couldn't afford any surprises tonight. He wasn't taking any chances. As he walked into the diner, he scanned the room. The soft hum of a jukebox played in the background, but the place was nearly empty, just a lone waitress wiping down the counter. Clint moved toward the back booth, the one with the faded red vinyl seats and chipped wooden table. He slid into the seat and waited. Moments later, the door creaked open, and a tall man in a leather jacket stepped inside. Clint recognized him immediately: John Barrett, a former Secret Service agent who had gone off the grid years ago. John had always been known for his no-nonsense attitude and sharp mind, two qualities that had made him one of Clint's most trusted partners in the field. John didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He slid into the seat across from Clint and gave him a sharp, assessing look. "So, what's this about, Clint?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. "You said you had something big." "I'm not in the business anymore, you know that." Clint leaned forward, his expression serious. "I wouldn't drag you back into this if it weren't absolutely necessary," he said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "This isn't just another job. This is bigger than anything I've ever dealt with." John raised an eyebrow. "Bigger than the cartel case in '95? Or the arms deal gone wrong in '02? Clint's face remained impassive. "Bigger. This goes all the way to the top. It involves people you wouldn't believe, high-level officials, businessmen, even government insiders. And it's all tied to a case that's about to blow wide open." John's eyes narrowed. "You're talking about the case in court, aren't you?" Clint nodded. "I handed over a dossier to Judge Anderson today. It's got names, dates, locations, everything we need to start connecting the dots. But there's more to it than what's in that file. There's a larger conspiracy at play here, one that stretches across international borders and involves players in the highest echelons of power." John leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "So, what's the plan? You want me to help you take down these people?" Clint's jaw tightened. "I need you to help me make sense of the information in that dossier. There are pieces in there that even I can't make sense of alone. We need to connect the dots before anyone else does. And trust me, there are people out there who won't hesitate to kill to keep this under wraps." John's gaze flickered to the door briefly, as if assessing the risk of continuing this conversation. After a long pause, he nodded. "All right, Clint. I'm in. But I want to know everything. No more secrets." Clint exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. John was on his side, and that was a huge relief. But they both knew the hardest part was yet to come. "There's no time to waste," Clint said, leaning forward. "We need to start gathering intel. I've already reached out to a few people, but we're going to need more eyes on this. There's too much at stake. We'll have to be careful, these people are dangerous, and they've got resources we can't even imagine. John nodded. I'll start going through the file. We need to figure out what's legitimate and what's a diversion. From the sounds of it, we're dealing with a lot more than just a few corrupt officials. This has the potential to bring down an entire system. Clint's mind flashed back to the case that had led him to this point, the one that had taken him from the quiet halls of Hollywood to the shadows of the Secret Service. He had always known that his time in the service would eventually collide with his life in the public eye, but he had never imagined it would be like this. Now, everything he had worked for, every life he had saved, was on the line. The key is going to be finding out who's behind it all, Clint said, his voice resolute. We need to find the mastermind pulling the strings. Once we identify him, we can start dismantling everything he's built. John's face darkened. And if we can't? What happens then? Clint's gaze hardened. Then we do whatever it takes to stop them. Because the alternative is unthinkable. They sat in silence for a moment, both men understanding the gravity of the situation. John finally broke the silence, his voice steady. All right. Let's get to work. Clint felt a surge of determination. They were in this together now, and there was no turning back. The enemy was out there, and it was more dangerous than either of them had imagined. But Clint had been in worse situations before, and he had come out on top. This time would be no different. The days that followed the secret meeting at the diner felt like a blur to Clint. Every moment was spent poring over the dossier, analyzing the information, and trying to make sense of the intricate web of connections it contained. It was a race against time, and Clint knew that the longer they waited, the more dangerous the situation became. John Barrett was a meticulous researcher, and within hours, he had already started making connections between the names, dates, and locations Clint had passed to him. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to fit together, but each new revelation brought more questions than answers. The deeper they dug, the more complex the conspiracy appeared. Clint had always known that the enemy they were dealing with would be powerful, but what he hadn't anticipated was the sheer scale of it. The players involved weren't just criminals, they were influential people who held high positions in government, law enforcement, and the business world. And those people were working together to protect their interests, no matter the cost. It didn't take long for Clint and John to realize that the conspiracy went much deeper than they had first thought. It wasn't just about corruption or illegal deals, it was a coordinated effort to manipulate the very systems that governed the country. The power structures that had always been in place, the government, the courts, the media, had been infiltrated at every level. And those who had done the infiltrating were smart, ruthless, and invisible. We're dealing with a shadow network, Clint said, slamming his fist on the table in frustration. These people operate in the dark, and they've covered their tracks so well that it's nearly impossible to trace them back to the source. They're everywhere, John. And they have people in every corner of this country. John nodded, his face grim. It's like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. But we have to keep pushing forward. If we don't, they'll continue to pull the strings from behind the scenes, and we'll never expose them. Clint agreed. They had no choice but to continue their investigation, even though every new lead seemed to take them further down a rabbit hole with no end in sight. As the days passed, Clint and John worked around the clock, uncovering more and more of the conspiracy. They tracked financial transactions, followed cryptic phone calls, and analyzed surveillance footage. Every piece of the puzzle brought them closer to the truth, but it also brought them closer to the people who were determined to stop them. The first real sign that they were being watched came late one evening when Clint returned to his apartment after a long day of working with John. He stepped inside, his senses immediately on high alert. The apartment seemed fine, nothing was out of place, but Clint knew better than to ignore the feeling creeping up his spine. He wasn't alone. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his concentration. He quickly retrieved it and saw that it was a message from John. "We're being followed. Watch your back." Clint's heart raced as he glanced around the room, his mind running through every possibility. He hadn't noticed anything strange on his way in, but now he was second-guessing everything. There were no signs of forced entry, but that didn't mean they hadn't been inside. The enemy they were dealing with had resources, and they knew how to cover their tracks. Clint didn't hesitate. He immediately began scanning the room for anything that looked out of place. His eyes settled on a small, barely noticeable pinprick in the wall near the window. Someone had been in here, and it wasn't just a random break-in. They were sending a message. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize. "You're getting too close. Stop while you can." The voice on the other end of the line was distorted, but Clint could hear the menace beneath it. The warning was clear: someone didn't want him digging any deeper into this case. Clint clenched his jaw, his determination hardening. "Not a chance," he muttered under his breath. He quickly packed up a few essentials, his phone, his backup gun, a few important documents, and slipped out of the apartment. His instincts screamed that it wasn't safe here anymore. He couldn't risk staying in one place for too long. As Clint drove away, he knew they were onto him. The message was loud and clear. The enemy wasn't just an abstract concept anymore. They were real, they were watching him, and they were willing to go to great lengths to stop him from exposing the truth. He dialed John's number. It rang once, twice, before John finally answered. "Clint, what's going on?" John asked, sounding tense. "They know," Clint said, keeping his voice low. "We're being watched. I just found a message. They're trying to warn me off." There was a pause on the other end. Clint could practically hear the wheels turning in John's head as he processed the information. "Shit. We need to meet." "Where are you?" "I'm heading to the warehouse we used last time. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Bring everything you've got. We need to lay low for a while." Clint hung up and tossed the phone into the passenger seat, his mind racing. They had to be careful. The enemy knew they were getting close, and they weren't going to let them get away unscathed. The clock was ticking, and Clint had no idea how long they could stay one step ahead. As he drove through the darkened streets, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate. The battle was no longer just about exposing a conspiracy. It was about survival. And Clint was determined to see it through to the end. The stakes had never been higher, and he wasn't backing down now. The warehouse was an abandoned relic from a time when the area had once been a bustling industrial hub. Now, it stood as a forgotten monument to the past, tucked away at the edge of town. The rusted exterior was barely visible from the main road, hidden by overgrown weeds and crumbling brick walls. It was the perfect place to lay low, isolated, empty, and far off the beaten path. Clint's heart pounded as he pulled into the lot. He parked his car behind a row of old, unused delivery trucks, careful to keep his movements as discreet as possible. Every shadow, every creak of the old building set his nerves on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He stepped out of the car and immediately checked his surroundings. The night was eerily quiet, with only the occasional whistle of the wind through the broken windows of the warehouse. Clint's breath came in shallow bursts as he moved toward the entrance, his hand resting lightly on the grip of his gun. Inside, the warehouse smelled of dust, rust, and abandonment. The dim light from a single bulb overhead cast long, jagged shadows across the concrete floor. Clint's footsteps echoed as he walked deeper into the space, the sound unnerving in the silence. He reached the back of the warehouse, where he and John had arranged to meet. The heavy metal door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing the hidden room they had used in the past for moments just like this, when the world seemed to be closing in, and they needed to regroup, plan, and stay out of sight. Clint was about to step inside when he froze. A noise. A faint sound that made his skin crawl. Someone was here. His eyes darted around the dimly lit space, but there was nothing. Just shadows. His instincts screamed at him to move. He slipped into the room, his movements swift and deliberate. The last thing he needed was an ambush, especially when he was alone. His mind raced. Where was John? Clint stepped further into the warehouse and activated his earpiece, trying to keep his voice low. John, are you there? Static crackled for a moment before John's voice came through. I'm here. What's going on? I don't know yet. I'm in position, but I'm getting the feeling someone's already here. Stay alert. There was a brief pause before John responded. Understood. I'll be there in 5. Clint clicked his earpiece off and surveyed the room again. Something wasn't right. The space felt off, like it had been disturbed recently. His mind raced as he went over every possible scenario. Could they have been tracked here? Had the enemy followed him? Then, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. Clint spun around, gun raised, only to find a man standing in the doorway. It was John. Jesus, Clint, John muttered, looking at Clint's gun with raised hands. I thought we were done with this kind of paranoia. Clint lowered the weapon, but the tension in his chest didn't subside. Better safe than sorry. You didn't check the area. I did, John said, walking further into the room. But I'm starting to think we might be looking for threats in the wrong place. They're not as obvious as we think. Clint nodded grimly, considering John's words. The enemy wasn't just people lurking in dark corners, they were smarter, more dangerous. And their movements were subtle, calculated. They didn't need to show themselves because they had already placed their pieces in motion. Clint turned to John, his expression hardening. We're going after them now. We're not waiting any longer. John's eyes narrowed. You're not seriously thinking about hitting them head-on, are you? Clint's jaw tightened. We have to. We're too far into this to back down. They'll keep coming for us until we end it. I'm not letting them control the narrative anymore. John let out a slow breath, his eyes scanning the shadows around them. All right. But we need a plan. We go in half-cocked, and we're dead. You know that. Clint exhaled through his nose, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. I know. We'll use the dossier. We know who the key players are now. We have to start with them, take down the people who control everything. If we break their foundation, the rest will crumble. John grunted in agreement. I'll get to work on the logistics. We'll need backup too. This isn't something we can handle alone. Clint nodded. We can't waste time. Start reaching out to people we trust. We'll need all the firepower we can get. But we keep it quiet. If anyone gets wind of this, we're finished. As John moved to the corner of the room to make some calls, Clint took a moment to himself. He stared out the dusty window, looking out into the darkened night. The world outside seemed calm, unaware of the storm that was brewing in the shadows. But Clint knew better. The enemy wasn't going to wait. He felt a surge of determination coursing through him. This wasn't just a battle for justice anymore. This was personal. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let it all slip away now. Whatever it took, Clint would make sure the people behind this conspiracy paid for their actions. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Clint pulled it out and saw a new message. Your next move will be your last. Leave it alone. Clint clenched his fists, the anger inside him burning hotter than ever. Whoever was behind this wanted him to quit. But quitting was never an option. Not for Clint Eastwood. He stood up, turning to face John, who had just finished making his calls. It's time, Clint said, his voice cold and resolute. Let's take them down. Clint felt a sense of urgency building within him as he stood in the warehouse, the weight of what they were about to do pressing heavily on his shoulders. The enemy they were up against was powerful, and Clint knew that one wrong move could be the difference between life and death. This was no longer just a mission to expose a conspiracy, it had become a fight for survival. John was on the phone with their contacts, setting up the logistics of the plan. Clint paced back and forth, his mind racing with possibilities. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. They needed to be smart, precise, and most importantly, they needed to keep the element of surprise. The longer they stayed hidden, the more likely the enemy would catch on to their intentions. Clint, John's voice broke through his thoughts. I've got the backup in place. We're ready. You're sure about this? Clint stopped pacing and turned toward him, his eyes steely with determination. We don't have a choice. We take them out now, or they'll take us down first. John sighed, clearly not thrilled with the idea, but he didn't argue. He understood what was at stake. Clint and John had been through enough together to know that when the mission was set, there was no turning back. All right, John said, his voice firm. I'll get the team in position. You stay sharp. The target is a building on the outskirts of the city. We've got a few key players inside, people who are part of the higher echelons of this conspiracy. If we hit them hard and fast, it'll cripple the operation. Clint nodded, a grim smile crossing his lips. Let's do this. As John began relaying instructions to their team, Clint took a moment to check his gear. He made sure his gun was loaded, his knife was secured, and his earpiece was functioning. Everything had to be perfect. They couldn't afford to have anything go wrong. The plan was simple: strike quickly, hit the core of the operation, and get out before anyone could react. Clint and John's team would infiltrate the building, neutralize the targets, and gather any remaining intel they could find. They couldn't afford to leave behind any evidence of their presence. If they wanted to get out of this alive, they needed to be ghosts. Within the hour, they were in motion. Clint, John, and the rest of the team moved out of the warehouse, making their way to the vehicles that would take them to the target location. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every car that passed by seemed to be lingering too long, every pedestrian too curious. But Clint knew that paranoia was a luxury they couldn't afford. As they neared the target building, Clint's heart rate increased. The place was an old industrial complex, abandoned for years but still standing strong. The perfect place for a covert operation like this. The shadows of the night provided them with cover, and Clint could see the faint outlines of their team members moving into position. Clint's earpiece crackled to life. We're in place, John's voice came through. You're clear to move. Clint signaled to the team. It was time. With the precision of well-trained professionals, they moved in, taking different entry points to avoid detection. Clint's senses were on high alert as he crept through the darkened hallways of the building, his footsteps barely making a sound on the concrete floor. He kept his gun close, ready for anything. As they neared the central chamber, Clint's instincts flared. The enemy was inside, he could feel it. The tension in the air was thick, and every corner they rounded seemed to get darker and more foreboding. Keep it tight, Clint whispered into his mic, no mistakes. The team spread out, sweeping the building methodically, taking down any guards they encountered. The adrenaline coursed through Clint's veins as they moved deeper into the building. They were getting closer. Finally, they reached the heart of the operation, the main office. It was here that Clint knew they would find the people pulling the strings. These were the ones who had been orchestrating everything from behind the scenes, the ones who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe. Clint signaled for the team to hold. They were right outside the door. Clint motioned for one of his team members to breach. With a swift kick, the door flew open, and Clint stormed into the room, gun raised. The office was dimly lit, and the smell of stale air mixed with something far more unsettling, fear. The room was filled with people, high-ranking individuals, dressed in sharp suits, their faces frozen in shock at the intrusion. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, chaos erupted. One of the men lunged for the phone on the desk, no doubt trying to call for backup. Clint didn't hesitate. He shot the phone out of his hand, the sharp crack of the gunshot echoing through the room. "Stay down!" Clint yelled, his voice firm and commanding. The group froze, and Clint could see the fear in their eyes. They knew who he was. They knew what he was capable of. He scanned the room quickly, his mind racing as he assessed the threat. A tall man in the back of the room, a man with a cold expression, made a move toward the door. Clint didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot at the ground in front of the man, and he froze in place, hands raised. "We don't want any trouble," the man said, his voice shaky. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Clint's eyes narrowed. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. You're the ones who've been pulling the strings, manipulating everything from the shadows. Your time is up." The room went silent again, the tension thick in the air. Clint could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. This was his moment. The culmination of everything they had worked for. "Tell me what you know," Clint demanded, his voice low and controlled. "Who's behind this?" The man chuckled nervously. "You think you can just walk in here and—" Before he could finish his sentence, Clint moved quickly, closing the distance between them. He grabbed the man by the collar and slammed him against the wall. The others watched in stunned silence. "I'm done asking," Clint growled. "You're going to tell me everything. Now." The man's eyes shifted between Clint and the others in the room. Clint could see the fear creeping in, the realization that he was no longer in control. The moment had come. Clint wasn't going to let anyone escape. The seconds after Clint's violent confrontation felt like hours. The air was thick with tension, every breath measured, every move deliberate. The man Clint had pinned to the wall was still frozen in fear, sweat trickling down his face, his eyes darting to the other individuals in the room, who stood in stunned silence. Clint's grip on the man's collar tightened. "Tell me everything," he demanded again, his voice low and dangerous. For a moment, it seemed as though the man might crack under the pressure, but then he shook his head, his lips trembling. "You won't get anything from me. It's bigger than you think. You're just a pawn in this whole thing." Clint's anger surged, but he kept it in check. He knew that intimidation alone wouldn't crack them all. He needed leverage. "Bigger than me?" Clint repeated with a smirk. "I'm not the one who's afraid, but I am the one who's about to change everything. If you're smart, you'll talk." The room seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the muffled beat of Clint's heart and the quiet rustle of the team members shifting their positions. The stakes had never been higher, and Clint knew the first piece of information they got would be the most crucial. John, who had been silently observing the standoff, stepped forward. "Clint," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a sense of urgency, "we don't have all night. They've got resources, and we've already made too much noise." Clint barely spared John a glance, but he nodded in agreement. "You're right. So, we're going to do this the hard way." He turned back to the man he was holding. "You know what happens to people who don't talk, don't you?" The man swallowed, his eyes darting to the others in the room as if seeking help. But there was no one to save him. His silence was more dangerous than his words. Clint could see the internal battle unfolding in the man's mind, the weight of the consequences sinking in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man exhaled shakily, his posture deflating in defeat. All right," he said, voice cracking. "I'll tell you what I know. But you have to promise me that my people will be left out of this. They don't know what I'm involved in." Clint's grip loosened just a fraction, giving the man a semblance of freedom, but he didn't let go completely. "Start talking," Clint growled, eyes narrowed. The man took a deep breath before speaking. I'm part of a network. We've been operating in the shadows for years. People like you, heroes, whistleblowers, journalists, you've all been on the radar. But it's not just about silencing people. We control assets. The ones pulling the strings. They've been setting up operations worldwide. What you stumbled into, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Clint's mind raced. This was bigger than anything he had anticipated. Who's behind this? He pressed. The man hesitated, clearly wrestling with the idea of naming names. I can't, not like this. But if you really want to know, it's not just about power. It's about control. The money, the resources, they're going to change the world, Clint. They want to pull the strings of entire countries. Clint's eyes flashed with anger. Names. Now. A nervous laugh escaped the man's lips. You really think it's that simple? You're dealing with people at the highest levels, corporations, government officials, military. They'll come for you, Clint. You won't be able to stop them. Clint's expression darkened. I'm already stopping them. The man flinched, but his lips remained sealed. Clint glanced at John, whose face was set with grim determination. They weren't getting what they needed, not yet. Clint had a feeling that this man knew more than he was letting on. John stepped forward, reading Clint's mind. Clint, we can't waste time. We need the intel now, or this whole operation goes south. Clint met John's gaze, then looked back at the man. He had one last tactic to try. All right, Clint said, lowering his voice to a near whisper. You've seen what I'm capable of. You know I can make things very difficult for you. But I'm offering you a chance, help us stop them, and I'll make sure you walk away from this. The man seemed to consider this for a moment, his breath quickening. You're not the first one to say that to me, he muttered under his breath. But you won't be the last either. Clint's patience was wearing thin. He took a deep breath, holding back the frustration building in his chest. Listen to me carefully, Clint said, his voice low and forceful. You talk, or I'll make sure you regret it. It's your choice. There was a long pause as the man's gaze flickered from Clint's determined eyes to the team members surrounding him. Finally, he spoke, but his words were quieter now, almost like a whisper. There's a meeting tomorrow. You won't find anyone else with the kind of power you're looking for unless you're there. It's a private gathering, off the grid. But the coordinates. I can give you those. You have to trust me. I'm not going to lie to you about that. Clint's pulse quickened. This was the break they had been waiting for. Give me the coordinates. The man quickly scribbled something down on a piece of paper and handed it to Clint. That's all I can give you. After this, I'm out. You'll be on your own. Clint took the paper without hesitation, glancing down at the hastily written numbers. It was a location, somewhere remote and off the radar, exactly where the masterminds behind the conspiracy would be. I'll take care of the rest, Clint said, his voice steady. But don't think this is over for you. You've got one shot at redemption. Help us, and we'll make sure you get out of this in one piece. The man nodded, his eyes wide with fear. I understand. As Clint and his team exited the building, they could feel the weight of what they had just learned. The battle was far from over, but now, they had a new target. The meeting tomorrow would be the key. If they could stop the people behind this, they might just have a chance at ending the conspiracy once and for all. Clint's heart raced as he thought about the days ahead. But as he stepped into the night, one thing was clear, this was no longer just a fight against corrupt officials and shadowy organizations. It was a fight for everything that mattered. And Clint wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. The early morning air was thick with tension. Clint stood beside John in the back of the van, glancing over the coordinates the man had given them. The private meeting was to take place at an abandoned facility, tucked away in a remote part of the mountains. The location was perfect for a covert operation, but it also meant one thing: they would be walking into the heart of enemy territory. "Are we ready for this?" John asked, his voice low but steady as he checked his own gear. Clint nodded, his jaw tight. "We don't have a choice. If we want to end this, we have to take them down now." John's face hardened. "I get that. But we need to keep our heads. These people aren't amateurs. We walk in too cocky, we'll be dead before we get a chance to act." Clint didn't need reminding. He was keenly aware of the dangers that lay ahead, but he had no intention of letting fear rule him now. The conspiracy had already cost too many lives. He wasn't about to let it continue. Not on his watch. The van rattled as it made its way down a winding mountain road, the trees on either side so thick it felt like they were driving through a tunnel of green. They were close now, just a few miles from the location, and Clint could feel the weight of their task pressing down on him. Everything had led to this moment. As they approached the facility, Clint gave a subtle signal for the van to slow. He peered out of the window, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The place was eerily quiet. A dilapidated building stood in the distance, surrounded by thick brush and overgrown weeds. It had all the hallmarks of a secretive meeting place: remote, isolated, and designed to be undetectable from the outside world. "Looks like it's abandoned," John muttered, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the facility through binoculars. Clint didn't respond immediately. His mind was working, trying to anticipate every possibility. The building could be a trap, but it could also be a true haven for the conspirators. Either way, they couldn't afford to be caught off guard. They would have to move in fast and neutralize the threat before they were surrounded. "We stick to the plan," Clint said finally, his voice firm. "In and out. No mistakes." The team, a small but highly trained group of operatives, prepared themselves for the mission. They moved out of the van silently, quickly gathering their gear. The men and women in Clint's team had been through countless missions together, but this one felt different. The stakes had never been higher, and Clint knew that their lives, perhaps even the future of the entire country, hinged on what happened in the next few hours. As they made their way toward the facility, Clint's thoughts wandered briefly to his past, how far he had come from his early days as a soldier, from the quiet man who had been thrust into the heart of this fight by circumstance. He had become something more over time. More than just a soldier. A leader. A protector. And now, as he approached the building, he could feel the weight of that responsibility more than ever. They reached the entrance of the facility, a large steel door that had seen better days. Clint motioned for the team to stop, and they crouched low, making sure they weren't visible to anyone inside. The door was locked, but Clint wasn't concerned. He pulled out a set of tools from his bag, expertly working the lock with practiced hands. It only took a few moments before the door clicked open. With a silent signal, Clint led the team inside. The facility was dark, the air thick with dust and the musty scent of decay. The building had been abandoned for years, yet it seemed eerily well kept on the inside, like someone had been maintaining it in secret. The silence was deafening, and Clint could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Something didn't feel right. He motioned for the team to spread out and move cautiously, making sure to check each room as they went. The silence continued, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional whisper through their comms. Clint could sense they were getting closer to the heart of the operation. This wasn't just a hideout, it was the nerve center of the conspiracy. As they moved through the corridors, Clint's mind raced. What were they going to find here? Could they actually stop the operation, or had they walked right into a trap? Without warning, a sharp noise echoed down the hallway, a loud metallic clank. Clint's body went rigid. He signaled for the team to halt. "Check your positions," Clint whispered into his mic, his voice barely audible. One by one, each member of the team reported in, confirming they were in position. The noise had come from further down the hallway, and Clint's instincts told him they were not alone. Stay sharp, Clint warned. They know we're here. John's voice crackled through the earpiece. We've got movement up ahead. Multiple hostiles. They're closing in. Clint's heart rate spiked. It was happening faster than he expected. They were walking straight into a fight, but it was too late to back out now. He motioned for the team to follow him, moving swiftly but cautiously toward the source of the noise. They reached a large open room, and Clint could see several figures moving in the shadows. On my signal, Clint murmured. Get ready. Clint's pulse thundered in his ears as he took a deep breath. This was it. The moment everything came down to. He counted down silently in his head, 3, 2, 1. Now. The team exploded into action, charging into the room with guns raised. The figures in the shadows reacted instantly, diving for cover and pulling weapons of their own. The room erupted into chaos. Gunshots rang out, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing off the walls. Clint's team was trained for moments like this. They moved with precision, returning fire while maintaining a calculated, methodical approach. Clint could feel the adrenaline surge through his body, pushing him forward. He took cover behind a large metal crate, his gun raised as he scanned the room. His eyes locked onto a familiar figure in the far corner, a man who had been one of the higher-ups in the conspiracy. It was him. Clint's heart skipped a beat as he realized that this was the man who held the key to everything. The man who had been orchestrating the entire operation from the shadows. He couldn't let him escape. Clint moved swiftly, his footsteps quiet as he darted across the room, positioning himself behind the man before he could react. He pressed his gun to the man's back. Not so fast, Clint growled. The man froze, a look of surprise crossing his face as he slowly turned to face Clint. You think you've won? The man sneered. You're just a pawn in a game much bigger than you realize. Clint's grip on the gun tightened. I'm done playing games. The room was filled with the echoes of the firefight. Clint's pulse raced as the man he had cornered stood frozen, eyes wide with fear and defiance. There was no way out for him now. Clint had him, and with it, the key to finally stopping the conspiracy that had haunted them for so long. The man let out a mocking laugh, though it was strained, almost panicked. You think this is over? You don't understand. You never did. Clint's eyes narrowed, his gun never wavering from the man's chest. I understand more than you think. The man shook his head, lips curling into a sneer. You're just a tool, Clint. A weapon they can control. You think you're the hero in all of this? You're nothing but another player in a much bigger game. Clint took a step closer, the room stilling with the weight of the words. Enough with the cryptic nonsense. Tell me what you know. Who's behind this? Who's pulling the strings? The man looked down at the ground for a long moment, considering his words carefully. When he looked up, his eyes were hard. It's not just one person. You want a name? Fine. It's not just about one name, Clint. It's about a network, a web of power, money, influence. Your government. Corporations. Military leaders. All of them. You've been chasing shadows. Clint's grip on the gun tightened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. You're telling me the whole system is corrupt? The man didn't answer immediately. He let the question hang in the air, an eerie silence filling the room. Finally, he spoke again. It's bigger than you, Clint. You have no idea who you're up against. Before Clint could respond, John's voice crackled through the comms. Clint, we've got company. A lot of them. Clint's attention snapped back to the room, adrenaline flooding his system. He looked toward the door, his senses heightened. How many? He whispered, his eyes scanning for any movement. More than we expected, John replied. We need to move now. Clint didn't hesitate. He jerked the man forward, pulling him into the line of sight as a human shield. "We're getting out of here. You're coming with me." The man grunted in protest, trying to pull away, but Clint's grip on him was unyielding. "You don't get to decide," Clint growled. "You're going to help me shut this operation down, whether you like it or not." The sound of boots pounding down the hallway echoed louder, signaling the arrival of reinforcements. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as he quickly assessed the situation. They had only one option left, to fight their way out. Clint motioned for his team to regroup, signaling them to fall into position behind cover. The firefight resumed, the sound of gunfire cutting through the air. Clint's breath was steady, his focus razor-sharp. This wasn't just about bringing down the conspiracy anymore, it was about survival. As the team returned fire, Clint kept his eyes locked on the man in front of him. "You're going to tell me everything," Clint spat. "Every name, every location. Or you'll regret it." The man gave him a cold, calculating look. "You think they'll let you walk away with that kind of intel? You're out of your depth, Clint. They'll come for you." Clint didn't flinch. "They've been coming for me the whole time." Just as Clint was about to press the man for more information, an explosion rocked the building. The floor beneath them trembled, and dust fell from the ceiling. Clint's team scrambled, instinctively dropping to the ground for cover. The man's expression shifted, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his face. "They're here," the man whispered. "They're activating the backup plan." Clint knew this was their chance. The man might have been a key figure in the operation, but now, they had a bigger problem. The backup forces had arrived. And they were more prepared than Clint's team had anticipated. "We're leaving," Clint ordered sharply. "Regroup at the exit. Now." The team didn't hesitate, moving quickly toward the rear exit of the building. Clint kept his eyes on the man, who was still trying to break free from his grip. "I don't know how much longer we have," Clint muttered. "So, you'd better start talking." The man chuckled darkly. "It won't matter. You won't stop them." With that, Clint shoved the man forward, pushing him toward the exit. The team moved in unison, clearing rooms and hallways as they made their way toward the back of the facility. Every step felt heavier than the last, knowing that the people they were up against would not stop. Not now. They reached the exit and burst through the door into the cold, crisp air of the mountain range. But the moment they stepped outside, they were met with more gunfire. A group of armed men had positioned themselves on the hillside, firing at Clint's team with precision. "Move!" Clint shouted, his voice a command that sliced through the chaos. He pushed the man ahead of him as a shield again, using him as cover while they made their way down the mountain path. The team returned fire as they moved, but Clint could feel the pressure building. They were surrounded, and time was running out. Every step felt like it could be their last. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Clint and his team reached the base of the mountain, where a helicopter was waiting to extract them. The moment they climbed aboard, Clint slammed the door shut and motioned for the pilot to take off. As the helicopter lifted off, Clint leaned back against the seat, breathing heavily, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He looked at the man who had once been an enemy, now a prisoner, his expression dark with defeat. Clint could sense the man's resentment, but he didn't care. They had made it out. But the war was far from over. "We've got what we need," Clint said, his voice steady. "But we're not done. This is just the beginning." The man didn't answer, but Clint could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. Clint wasn't sure if the man fully understood yet, but he would. Clint was done being controlled. Done being a pawn. He had just become the king. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The helicopter soared through the sky, its blades slicing through the crisp mountain air as Clint stared out the window, the weight of their escape heavy on his mind. The mountain landscape below seemed so peaceful, but Clint knew better. The calm was an illusion. The battle had only just begun. The man they had captured was seated across from Clint, his eyes darting nervously from one member of the team to the next. He was beginning to realize the magnitude of what he had gotten himself into. Clint could see the fear behind his confident exterior, the cracks in his defiant facade. Clint leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "You've been running this operation for years. Now, it's over. It's time for you to tell me everything." The man, whose name was Victor Blackwell, swallowed hard. He'd been one of the key architects of the covert network that had been destabilizing governments and orchestrating chaos across the globe. Clint had learned that much during their brief interrogation, but the details were still elusive. Victor stared back at Clint, his lips curling into a tight smile, though it was clear he was weighing his options. "You think I'm scared of you," he sneered. "You've just scratched the surface. I have people everywhere. You'll never stop this." Clint didn't flinch. "I don't need to stop everything. Just you. And when you talk, I'll make sure you're still breathing when this is all over." He leaned in closer, his voice low and dangerous. "I know you're scared. You wouldn't have run if you weren't." Victor laughed bitterly. "You don't understand. There's no running from this. You're too late." Clint felt his patience thinning. He wanted to get more out of the man, but he knew better than to let his temper get the best of him. He straightened up and motioned for the rest of the team to keep their eyes on their prisoner. The helicopter banked hard to the left, signaling that they were nearing their destination. Clint glanced at the others. John, Sarah, and the rest of the team were all looking tense, waiting for the next move. They had been through countless firefights and dangerous missions, but nothing like this. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the future. The pilot's voice crackled over the comms. "We'll be landing at the safe house in 5 minutes. You better have a plan, Clint. The intel we've got is top tier, but it's not going to do us much good if we can't figure out who's pulling the strings." Clint nodded, his mind working furiously. They had the key player. But this was bigger than one man. Victor might know names, locations, and contacts, but he was only a part of a larger puzzle, one that stretched far beyond what Clint had ever imagined. "I know," Clint replied, his tone steady. "We'll get what we need from him. We're not leaving until we've got the full picture." The helicopter descended toward the small, nondescript airstrip in the middle of nowhere. A secure facility. It was the perfect place to interrogate Victor without interference. The team disembarked quickly, securing their weapons and readying themselves for whatever came next. They ushered Victor into a small, sterile interrogation room, the walls bare except for a single dim light hanging above. Clint took a seat across from him, arms crossed, eyes fixed on his prisoner. Victor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under Clint's unyielding gaze. After a long, tense silence, he spoke, his voice quieter this time. "You don't know what you're dealing with. The web you're trying to unravel. It's deep, Clint. Way deeper than you could ever imagine." Clint's brow furrowed. "Start talking. Who's the real leader? Who's at the top of all of this?" Victor hesitated again, but then, with a resigned sigh, he leaned forward. "The network is bigger than you think. There's a cabal, an elite group, and they're untouchable. But the one pulling the strings, he's not who you think." Clint leaned in, every muscle in his body tensed. "Who?" Victor's eyes flicked to the door, as if to ensure they weren't being overheard. He lowered his voice to a near whisper. "It's a man named Elias Crane." Clint's pulse skipped. "Crane? I've never heard of him." Victor's laugh was bitter. "You wouldn't have. He operates from the shadows. A ghost. His name doesn't come up in any official records. Not unless you're deep inside the system. He's the one who orchestrated everything, the wars, the chaos, the corrupt deals. He's the mastermind behind the curtain, the one who has every major player in his pocket. Presidents, CEOs, generals, he controls them all. And he's been doing it for years. Clint sat back in his chair, stunned by the revelation. He had been chasing down leads, running from one operation to the next, thinking it was all part of some fractured conspiracy. But this was on a whole new level. Elias Crane was the architect, the man at the top. And Clint had been chasing ghosts all along. Where is he? Clint asked, his voice steady but his mind racing. Victor chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. You think I know? I'm just a small piece of the puzzle, Clint. But I can tell you this much, Crane is close. Closer than you think. And he's always 3 steps ahead of you. Clint's mind raced. If Victor was telling the truth, they had to act fast. They couldn't let Crane slip away. They couldn't afford to keep chasing shadows. Suddenly, the door to the interrogation room burst open. John stood in the doorway, his face pale, eyes wide. Clint, you need to see this. Clint stood, a feeling of dread settling over him. He turned to Victor, whose expression had shifted from defiance to a look of genuine fear. Crane is already ahead of you, Victor said, his voice a mere whisper. And now, you've made him notice you. Clint's stomach dropped as he followed John down the hall, his mind racing. Something was happening. Something big. And it wasn't just a coincidence that Victor had revealed Crane's name now. As they reached the control room, Clint's eyes fell on the monitor. A large red warning flashed across the screen. The words, "System breach," stared back at him. John spoke grimly. Someone's hacking into our system. And it's not just any hacker. It's Crane's people. They're already in. Clint's worst fears were coming true. Crane was making his move. And this time, Clint was at the center of it all. Lock everything down, Clint ordered. We need to shut him out. Now. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about keeping secrets secure. It was about keeping their lives intact. And it was about to get a whole lot harder. The control room was eerily quiet, save for the rapid tapping of fingers on keyboards. Clint stood with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the monitors in front of him. The flashing red lights were like a heartbeat, pulsing with urgency. The team was scrambling, trying to block Elias Crane's infiltration, but Clint could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier with every second. John, the team's tech expert, was frantically typing away, sweat beading on his forehead. We've got a breach. Full access. Whoever Crane has on the inside is good. We've lost control of our systems. Clint's mind raced as he scanned the data flashing on the screen. They had been so close. So close to shutting down the operation. And now, they were at risk of losing everything. Can you trace the signal? Clint asked, his voice tense. John shook his head. They've masked it. I can't pinpoint the location. But we've got a bigger problem. Clint's stomach twisted. What problem? John turned to face him, his expression grim. We're not the only ones being hacked. I just got an alert, Crane's people have access to every secure database we've been tracking. Every name. Every file. He knows what we know. And he's using it against us. Clint slammed his fist into the wall. Damn it. Clint, Sarah's voice came from the doorway. She was standing there, eyes wide with concern. We've got company. It's not just a hack. I think they're coming for us. Clint turned to her, his jaw clenched. What do you mean, coming for us? Sarah's face was pale, her lips tight. I've been monitoring satellite feeds. A convoy is heading our way. Armed, and moving fast. They'll be here in less than an hour. Clint swore under his breath. We don't have much time. He turned back to John, who was still trying to regain control of the system. How long before we can lock Crane out? John didn't look up, his hands flying across the keys. If we can isolate the breach and resecure our systems, it'll take at least 30 minutes. Maybe more. Clint's mind was already calculating. 30 minutes. They didn't have 30 minutes. We're not going to make it, Clint muttered. We need to move now. Get the team to the backup safe house. Lock down this place, and get ready for a fight. We're not giving Crane the upper hand. Clint's voice was sharp, commanding. The team had been through too much to let it all fall apart now. John nodded. I'll keep working on the systems, try to buy us some time. Clint motioned to Sarah. We need to keep Victor secure. If Crane knows about him, we're dead. Make sure he's locked down, and get him ready to move. Sarah gave a sharp nod, already on her way to execute the orders. Clint turned to the rest of the team, who were quickly gathering their gear and weapons. We don't know what we're walking into, Clint said, his voice low but firm. But I'll be damned if we let Crane walk all over us. We fight. We survive. And we take him down, no matter what. The team nodded, a unified front of determination. They had come too far to let it end here. But Clint knew the stakes had never been higher. They were playing a dangerous game now, and it was far from over. The convoy was closing in. Clint's heart raced as he made his way to the armory, checking his weapon one last time. He knew what was coming, and he wasn't about to let anything catch him off guard. Not again. The team gathered in the secure hallway, weapons in hand, their faces set in grim determination. Clint moved to the front, taking his place as the leader. This was his mission, his fight. But this time, it wasn't just about taking down the bad guys. It was about protecting the people who had come to rely on him. Is everything set? Clint asked, looking around at the team. John stepped forward. We've got a secure line to the backup safe house, but I've got a feeling we won't make it there without a fight. Then we fight, Clint replied. We don't back down. The sound of boots echoed down the hallway. It wasn't just the team. The convoy had arrived. Clint motioned for the team to take their positions, spreading out to cover every entrance. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Clint could feel it in his bones, this was it. The final confrontation. Sarah took her place by the door, her eyes scanning for any movement outside. They're here, she whispered. They've got us surrounded. Clint nodded. We move on my signal. Wait for the first shot. And then, it happened. The first shot rang out, sharp, echoing through the walls. Clint's instincts kicked in. He rushed toward the door, leading the charge as the team opened fire, taking down the first wave of attackers. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Clint's heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he moved fluidly with his team. The attackers were relentless, but Clint had something they didn't, determination. Victor was still a liability. Clint knew that. But if they didn't make it out of here alive, the entire operation would fall apart. Crane's people couldn't be allowed to win. Not after everything they had sacrificed. The team worked like a well-oiled machine, each member doing their part. Clint moved through the chaos, taking down attackers with precision, his mind focused solely on the mission. The seconds felt like hours. But finally, the last of the attackers fell. The silence that followed was deafening. Clint wiped the sweat from his brow, his chest heaving. They had made it. For now. We need to move, he said, his voice urgent. Get to the backup safe house. Now. They moved quickly, leaving the facility behind. Clint's heart still raced, but the mission was far from over. Elias Crane had just shown them the depth of his reach. But Clint was more determined than ever. He wasn't about to let this fight end in failure. As they made their way to the extraction point, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. And Crane was still out there. The quiet of the backup safe house was a relief compared to the chaos of the previous hours. Clint sat in a dimly lit corner of the room, his mind still reeling from the ambush. The team had made it out alive, but at what cost? The relentless assault had put everyone on edge, and the fact that they were still breathing felt like a small miracle. But Clint knew better than to celebrate too soon. Elias Crane was still out there, pulling strings from the shadows, and the longer they stayed hidden, the more dangerous their position became. The safe house was secure, for now, but it wouldn't stay that way. Clint stood, walking over to the table where a map of their next potential moves lay spread out. His fingers brushed over the routes, each line drawn in blue marker, each one more dangerous than the last. They had to track Crane, but to do that, they needed answers. And those answers were locked in the depths of the system they had just lost control of. John was hunched over a laptop, still trying to salvage whatever he could from the breach. Clint could see the frustration etched on his face. "Any luck?" Clint asked. John's fingers flew over the keys. "Not much. Whoever Crane has working for him is good. Too good. I'm getting snippets of data, but nothing concrete. It's like trying to grab smoke." Clint's mind raced. They needed to find a lead, something, anything that could point them in Crane's direction. But it was like they were searching for a needle in a haystack. "Keep at it," Clint said, his voice low. "I need answers, John. We don't have time to waste." John nodded but didn't look up from his screen. Clint turned to Sarah, who was pacing back and forth, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She looked just as unsettled as he felt. "Talk to me, Sarah," Clint said, his voice steady but with an edge. "What's going on in that head of yours?" She stopped pacing, her eyes meeting his. "I'm thinking about Crane. About everything he said. He's a ghost, Clint. No one knows who he really is. The cabal he's part of, it's huge. And Victor's warning wasn't just some last-minute threat. He's trying to tell us that we're way out of our depth." Clint's gaze hardened. "I didn't come this far to back down. If Crane thinks we're just going to walk away, he's dead wrong." Sarah shook her head, clearly worried. "I get that. But think about it. If Crane's network is as deep as Victor says, we're not just up against him. We're up against the people who've been backing him for years. This is bigger than us now." Clint paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. She wasn't wrong. Elias Crane wasn't just some rogue criminal. He was a cog in a much larger machine, a machine with resources, power, and reach that stretched far beyond what Clint had anticipated. "I don't care how big his network is," Clint said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We're taking him down. We've got Victor. We've got the knowledge. We fight smart, we fight dirty. And we don't stop until we end this." John finally looked up from his laptop, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. "Clint, I found something." Clint turned to him immediately, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" John's hands hovered over the keys, his expression grim. "It's a secure file, hidden deep in the archives. It's labeled, Crane, Operation Final Phase. It's encrypted, but I've broken part of the code. This file, it's the key to everything." Clint leaned forward, the tension rising in his chest. "Where is it? What does it say?" John tapped a few more keys, and the screen flickered to life, revealing a set of coordinates and a time, 12 a.m., 48 hours from now. "These coordinates," John said, "they're leading us to a location off the coast. But there's more. These aren't just random numbers. They match up with a series of other secret operations in the past few months. This is it. This is Crane's next move." Clint felt a surge of adrenaline. The file was proof of a concrete lead. They now had the coordinates. But what awaited them there? And how much of a head start did Crane have? "All right," Clint said, standing up and moving toward the door. "Pack up. We leave in an hour." John, Sarah, and the rest of the team nodded, their expressions set with determination. They had been through hell already, but now, they were stepping into the heart of it. If this was Crane's next move, they had to stop him before it was too late. The next hour felt like an eternity. Clint sat silently, running over every possible scenario in his mind. Every lead, every twist, every person they had crossed paths with. He couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. As the team gathered their gear, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The pieces were falling into place too easily. Elias Crane was no amateur. He wasn't going to leave a trail of breadcrumbs for them to follow. "Clint," Sarah's voice broke his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her eyes narrowed in concern. "I'm not sure this is a straightforward hit. Something feels off." Clint turned to her, his gaze sharp. "I agree. But we've got to take the risk. If we don't act, we'll never know what he's planning." "I know," Sarah replied, but the hesitation in her voice was clear. "Just, be careful. This feels like a trap." Clint's eyes flicked toward the map again, tracing the route to the coordinates. He didn't have time for doubts. They had to go. "I'm not worried about a trap. I'm worried about us getting there first." The team boarded the transport vehicle, the engine roaring to life as they made their way toward the coordinates. Clint couldn't help but feel the pressure of the situation. Time was running out. If Crane's operation was as dangerous as Victor had said, they were walking into a nightmare. But they had no choice. The clock was ticking. The convoy made its way down the long, empty highway, the sound of tires on asphalt rhythmic beat in Clint's ears. The silence was suffocating, every passing minute drawing them closer to the unknown. "Get ready," Clint said, his voice steady but firm. "This is it. We move fast, we hit hard, and we don't look back." They all nodded, preparing for the final confrontation. They didn't know what they would face when they reached the coordinates. But Clint was determined to end it. Whatever Elias Crane had planned, they weren't going to let it happen. The transport vehicle rumbled along the winding coastal road, the salty sea breeze rushing through the cracked windows. Clint sat at the front, his eyes scanning the landscape as the team's convoy made its way toward the coordinates they had uncovered. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a shadowy hue. A sense of urgency hung in the air, the weight of the mission pressing down on Clint's chest. They were close now. Too close to turn back. John, sitting next to him, was once again absorbed in his laptop, tapping away as his fingers moved like a blur across the keyboard. "I'm running another scan of the area," he murmured. "Something's not right. I can't shake the feeling that Crane's expecting us." Clint didn't respond right away. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, his thoughts spinning. John was right. It was too convenient, the file they'd uncovered, the clear path that had led them directly to this location. It was almost like Crane wanted them to find it. "Do you think it's a trap?" Sarah's voice came from the back of the vehicle, her tone sharp. Clint hesitated, his gaze still fixed on the road. "It's possible. But we can't afford to assume anything. We've already lost too much time." John looked up from his screen, his face tight with concentration. "I'm getting something," he said, his voice rising with an edge of excitement. "Satellite feeds picking up movement near the coordinates. A lot of movement." Clint's pulse quickened. "How many?" John paused, typing rapidly, his brow furrowed. "I can't give you an exact number. But it looks like a small army. Armed personnel. They're gearing up for something." Clint leaned forward, feeling the gravity of the situation weigh down on him. "How much time do we have?" "Minutes. Less than 5, John replied, his voice tense. Clint turned to Sarah, his mind racing. We're moving in. Get the team ready. We're not waiting for a better moment. Sarah nodded, her hand already reaching for her gear. We go in hard, no hesitation. The vehicle sped up, the tires crunching against the gravel as the team braced themselves. Clint could feel the adrenaline kicking in, his heart pounding in his chest as the convoy made its final approach. They arrived at the location just as the first stars began to appear in the night sky. The area was eerily quiet, a barren stretch of coastline surrounded by jagged rocks and high cliffs. The building they were heading toward was an old, abandoned facility, its rusted metal walls blending into the landscape like a forgotten relic. Clint's instincts flared. It didn't feel right. The silence, the lack of activity, it was too perfect, too still. He motioned for the team to dismount quickly, the sound of boots hitting the ground breaking the stillness. Spread out, Clint ordered, his voice low but firm. We don't know what we're walking into, so stay sharp. Keep your heads down and your eyes open. This could be the final confrontation. The team split up, moving with precision as they approached the building. Clint led the way, his senses heightened, every muscle in his body primed for action. As they neared the entrance, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. This was it. The moment they had been working toward. They reached the door, and Clint paused, motioning for the team to halt. He signaled to John, who approached a small panel on the wall next to the door. I'm in, John muttered, typing a few commands into the panel's keypad. It's not locked, but the security systems are still active. I can disable them, but it'll take a second. Clint's eyes never left the door. The seconds felt like minutes as John worked, his fingers dancing over the keys. Then, with a soft beep, the door unlocked with a loud click. We're in, John said, his voice calm but urgent. Clint nodded. Move in. Stay tight. The team slipped inside, weapons raised, moving quickly through the dark, cavernous hallway. The air inside smelled damp and stale, as if the building had been abandoned for years. But Clint knew better. This wasn't some forgotten structure, it was a fortress. Something's off, Sarah whispered from behind him. It's too quiet. Clint motioned for everyone to stop. The hairs on his neck stood up again. They were walking into the lion's den, and the lion was waiting. John tapped Clint on the shoulder, pointing to a set of monitors mounted on the wall. The screens flickered to life, revealing a live feed of their movements. Someone was watching. Crane, Clint muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. He knows we're here. Just as he said it, the facility's lights flickered, and a low hum vibrated through the floor. Suddenly, the walls seemed to come alive with the sounds of mechanical whirring and the ominous clang of metal doors closing. Ambush, Sarah hissed. We're surrounded. Clint's mind raced. There was no way out of this now. They were too deep, too far in to turn back. We fight, Clint said, his voice hardening with resolve. We take control of this place, and we make sure Crane knows we're here to end this. No more running. John was already at a terminal, typing furiously. I can't stop the lockdown, but I can trigger a counter-response. Give us an opening. Do it, Clint commanded. The team tightened their formation, each person standing at the ready, weapons aimed. Clint could feel the tension building, the inevitability of the fight that was about to unfold. Then, without warning, the doors on either side of them opened, and armed guards flooded the hall. The first wave crashed into them, and the sound of gunfire erupted into the air. Clint's instincts kicked in, his training taking over as he moved through the chaos. He fired, hitting his targets with precise, practiced shots, each one dropping to the ground. But they were outnumbered, and the walls of the facility seemed to close in around them. Move! Clint shouted as he ducked behind a pillar for cover. Push forward. We need to find Crane. The team moved with calculated urgency, their backs against the walls as they advanced. The fight was intense, each moment a blur of gunfire and combat. But Clint was focused. They had a mission, to find Crane and stop him, once and for all. The team pushed deeper into the facility, each corner they turned leading them closer to their objective. Clint could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. They were in the belly of the beast now, and there was no turning back. But even as they fought their way through the compound, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Elias Crane had set this up, and they had walked right into his trap. The pieces were all falling into place, and the danger was greater than they had anticipated. In the heart of the facility, a door creaked open, leading them to the room that would change everything. The team moved cautiously through the darkened hallways of the facility. Each step was a calculated risk, every corner a potential ambush. The air felt thick with tension, and the echoes of their boots on the concrete floor reverberated through the abandoned corridors. Clint's mind raced, his senses hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow. They had reached the inner sanctum of Elias Crane's operation, and there was no going back. Clint motioned for the team to stop. They had come to a large, steel-reinforced door, heavily guarded. The perimeter was quiet for now, but Clint could feel that they were being watched by someone who knew exactly how to anticipate their next move. The facility's isolation, the dead silence, everything screamed that this was where the game would be decided. John was already at the control panel, working quickly to bypass the security measures. His fingers flew across the screen, his face lit by the cold glow of the monitor. "We've got one shot at this," John muttered. "If I can get this door open, we'll have access to the central hub, but I'm not sure how much time we'll have before backup arrives." Clint's eyes narrowed. "We don't need time. We need an opening." John's fingers paused. "Just give me a few more seconds." Clint turned to Sarah. She was crouched low, scanning the hallway with intense focus. "You good?" Clint asked, his voice steady despite the pounding of his own heart. Sarah's gaze was sharp, but there was a trace of unease in her eyes. "For now. But this place, it's designed to keep people in, not out. The deeper we go, the more dangerous it gets." Clint nodded. "Then we finish it here. No second chances." With a final click, the control panel whirred to life. The large steel door in front of them groaned as it slowly began to open, revealing a dimly lit corridor beyond. Clint motioned for the team to move. They couldn't afford to hesitate. The team slipped through the door and into the heart of the facility. The hallway was dark, but Clint could see faint red lights blinking along the walls, indicators of the security systems that still buzzed behind the scenes. He could feel his pulse quicken. Every step brought them closer to Crane. They moved silently, checking every door, every corner, every shadow. They had to find the central control room. They had to find Crane. John kept his eyes glued to his screen, his fingers tapping rapidly on his device. "There it is," he whispered. "We're almost there. Just a few more rooms down this corridor." Clint led the way, his weapon held at the ready. His mind was racing, his thoughts consumed by one question: what would they find when they finally confronted Elias Crane? Would it be him, standing in the shadows like the puppet master he was? Or would they walk into yet another trap? As they turned the final corner, Clint's instincts flared. He could feel the danger closing in. The team had reached the heart of the compound, and it was now or never. They reached a large set of double doors. The control room was beyond it. Clint motioned for the team to hold their position while he checked the door for traps. "Clear," Clint whispered, after a tense moment of inspection. He nodded to Sarah and John, who readied themselves for the confrontation. Clint's hand hovered over the door handle, but he hesitated for a brief moment. A cold feeling gnawed at him, something didn't feel right. John must have sensed it too. "Clint, I don't like this." Everything's too quiet. Too perfect. I think we're about to walk into the lion's den. Clint met John's gaze, and for a brief second, he saw the same uncertainty reflected in his eyes. But they didn't have time for doubts. It's now or never, John, Clint replied, his voice steady. With a deep breath, Clint pushed open the door. Inside was a massive, high-tech control room. Rows of monitors filled the space, each one displaying live footage from different parts of the facility. The hum of machinery was constant, the sound reverberating off the steel walls. In the center of the room, standing by a large console, was Elias Crane. He was exactly as Clint had imagined, a tall man, dressed in dark clothes, his eyes sharp and calculating. He stood with an air of quiet confidence, as if he had been expecting them all along. "Well, well," Crane said, his voice smooth and cold. "I must say, I'm impressed. I didn't think you'd make it this far." Clint's hand tightened around his weapon, but he didn't move. He knew better than to act rashly. "This ends now, Crane." Crane smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Does it, Clint? Does it really?" The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut through. Clint studied Crane's every movement, every flicker of emotion on his face. This was the moment that would determine everything. He had to be careful. One wrong move, and it could all fall apart. "You don't understand, do you?" Crane continued, his tone almost amused. "This isn't about me. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us." Clint narrowed his eyes. "I've heard enough of your games. Whatever it is, we're ending it." Crane's eyes flickered to the monitors, and Clint instinctively tensed. He knew something was coming. "You're already too late," Crane said, his voice almost a whisper. "The operation is already in motion. It's happening as we speak." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Crane's lips curled into a smirk. "The chaos has already begun. The pieces are in play, Clint. You're just a distraction." Suddenly, the monitors flickered, and a series of alarms blared to life. Red lights flashed, bathing the room in an ominous glow. "Time's up," Crane said, his voice barely audible over the alarm. Before Clint could react, the room was flooded with armed guards, their weapons raised and aimed at the team. The control room doors slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. "Ambush!" Sarah shouted, raising her weapon as she spun around. Clint moved fast, firing at the guards as they poured into the room. But there were too many of them, and they were already in position. The fight had escalated in an instant, and Clint knew they were outnumbered. "We need to get out," John yelled, backing toward the door they had entered through. Clint wasn't ready to retreat, but the situation was rapidly deteriorating. If they didn't make a move now, they would be overwhelmed. "Fall back," Clint shouted. "Regroup." The team made a quick retreat, moving through the chaos. Clint fired back as they ran, but the guards were closing in. They were trapped in the heart of the storm, and their chances of escaping were growing slimmer by the second. As the door to the control room slammed shut behind them, Clint knew they had one final chance to stop Crane. And if they failed, if they couldn't break through this final defense, they would lose everything. The walls of the control room reverberated with the sound of gunfire, each shot ringing out with lethal precision. Clint's heart hammered in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he led his team in a desperate fight for survival. The door to the control room slammed shut behind them, and with it, any hope of retreat. They were trapped. Sarah, her face tense but focused, was already firing at the guards who had rushed in from every side. Her shots were quick and accurate, but the number of opponents was overwhelming. The team was boxed in, and every corner they turned only seemed to reveal more enemies. The alarms still blared in their ears, making it almost impossible to think straight. But Clint knew one thing: this wasn't just a fight for survival. This was the moment that would define everything. "Keep moving," Clint shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need an exit." He motioned for the team to regroup near a side exit, but as he turned to take cover behind a nearby pillar, he caught a glimpse of Crane standing at the control panel, still smirking as if nothing were wrong. It was almost maddening how calm the man seemed in the face of such chaos. Was this all part of his plan? The answer hit Clint like a ton of bricks. "This isn't just about us," Clint muttered under his breath, his mind working furiously. Crane wasn't trying to stop them from escaping. He was trying to lead them into something even worse. Something far more dangerous. "Clint." John's voice snapped him back to the moment. He had fallen back against the wall, tapping at his tablet furiously. "The security systems are locked down, there's no way out unless we take control of the main server." Clint's eyes narrowed. "So, it's a fight for control, then?" "Exactly," John said, his fingers still flying over the screen. "But we're running out of time. I'm picking up more movement on the surveillance systems. We're not alone here. Crane's got more reinforcements coming in." Clint's thoughts raced. They had been expecting an ambush, but this wasn't just an ambush, it was a coordinated effort to trap them in the heart of the compound. They needed to take control of the situation, and fast. "Sarah, take point," Clint ordered, his voice firm. "John, keep working on those systems. We need to disable the lockdown, or we're all dead." Sarah nodded without hesitation, her eyes scanning the room as she moved forward, taking down 2 more guards with swift, practiced shots. Clint's breath caught in his throat as he watched her work. She was a force of nature, a soldier in every sense of the word. Clint turned his attention back to the control panel, where John was still working to break through Crane's defenses. The tension was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity. "Got it." John's voice broke through the deafening alarm. The lights flickered and then went out completely, leaving them in darkness for a split second before emergency lights kicked in. "That's it. I've overridden the lockdown protocols," John shouted. Clint's heart leaped. It was their opening. "Move," he yelled, as he sprinted forward with Sarah right behind him. They had to reach the server room, the heart of the facility where Crane's operations were running. They fought their way through the facility, taking down any guards that dared to stand in their way. Clint's mind stayed focused on the mission, on Crane, and on what was waiting for them at the end of this hall. Every corner they turned felt like another step deeper into the unknown, but they couldn't afford to hesitate. As they reached the server room, Clint saw something that made his blood run cold. Crane wasn't alone. A man stood next to him, tall and imposing, his face shadowed by the dim light. His hands were bound by handcuffs, but it was his face that stopped Clint in his tracks. Elias Crane smiled at them as Clint and his team entered the room. "Well done," Crane said, his voice dripping with mock approval. "You've made it this far, but now it's time to finish the game." The man standing next to Crane raised his head, his eyes wide with desperation. It was Michael, Sarah's younger brother, the one they had thought had been lost to them forever. "No!" Sarah shouted, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Michael?" Clint could see the pain and confusion in Sarah's eyes as she took in the sight of her brother, helpless and terrified. Her weapon trembled in her hand, but she didn't fire. She couldn't. Crane's smile grew wider, more sinister. "Surprised? I thought you'd be happy to see him. After all, he's been instrumental in helping me get this far. It's time to see how far your loyalty stretches, Sarah." Clint's heart pounded as the situation spiraled out of control. They had known they were walking into danger, but this was something else entirely. Crane had used Sarah's brother as leverage. It was a low blow, even by his standards. "Let him go, Crane," Sarah demanded, her voice cracking with emotion. "Let him go." Crane laughed, the sound echoing off the walls. He's the final piece of the puzzle, Sarah. Without him, none of this would have been possible. And now, you have a choice to make. Clint's eyes darted to the monitors around the room. The control systems had changed, and Crane's operations were moving at full speed. This wasn't just about taking control of the facility, it was about starting something far bigger, something that Clint knew could threaten everything they had worked for. Enough of your games, Crane, Clint said, his voice low and dangerous. You're done. But Crane only smirked, his eyes glinting with cold calculation. You think so? This is bigger than both of us. You can't stop it now. It's already in motion. Clint took a step forward, his hand tightening around his weapon. We'll see about that. Without warning, the room erupted in chaos. Guards burst in from all sides, their weapons drawn, as a hail of gunfire filled the air. Sarah dove to the side, her brother's figure still etched in her mind. She fired back at the approaching soldiers, but she couldn't take her focus off of Michael. He was her weakness, and Crane knew it. Clint and John moved quickly, taking cover behind the nearest server racks. The firefight was intense, each shot from their opponents pushing them further back. But they couldn't back down now. This was the moment. They had to act. John, disable the security systems, now. Clint shouted over the roar of gunfire. John was already working on it, his fingers moving rapidly as he accessed the terminal. But every second felt like an eternity. The team was running out of time, and the situation was escalating faster than they could respond. They had to make a choice, save Michael or stop Crane. There was no way to do both. The room erupted in chaos. Gunfire echoed through the walls, sharp and unrelenting. Sarah's heart raced as she crouched behind a server rack, her weapon in hand, her eyes never leaving her brother's terrified face. He was still chained to the chair, helpless in the middle of the storm. Clint and John were both moving with the precision of trained soldiers, covering the perimeter, but the real threat was Crane. He was the puppet master in this game, pulling the strings from behind the control panel, his eyes glinting with cruel delight. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as her thoughts swirled. Michael was alive. The brother she thought she'd lost forever, the one she'd grieved for, he was right there in front of her. But he wasn't the same. He had been used, manipulated. The man she knew was gone, replaced by someone who had been swallowed whole by Crane's operations. The betrayal ran deep. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't let Crane win. Her finger tightened on the trigger as another guard approached from her left. She shot first, her aim steady, the guard collapsing to the floor. But there were more, so many more, filling the room. It was a tidal wave of enemies closing in, and each second that passed was another moment they lost. Clint shouted orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. We need to move, now. He and John worked in tandem, keeping the guards at bay as Sarah inched toward Michael. Her brother's eyes locked with hers for a moment, a flicker of recognition in the storm of confusion. He was still there. But how much of him was still Michael, and how much had been twisted by Crane's influence? Could she save him? Or was it already too late? Sarah, focus. Clint's voice jolted her back into the fight. She nodded, trying to push the personal anguish aside. They didn't have time for doubt. They needed to end this. And they needed to do it now. But how? Every step forward seemed like a mistake. With every guard that fell, more seemed to take their place. It felt like the walls were closing in. Suddenly, the sharp, authoritative voice of Crane broke through the firefight. You can't keep this up forever, Clint. You're outgunned, outmanned, and trapped. There's no way out. Clint didn't flinch. He knew exactly what Crane was trying to do, break their will. He wasn't going to let it work. The only thing trapped here is you, Crane. Clint's eyes swept the room, calculating. There had to be a way. They couldn't just fight their way out, they needed to cut the head off the snake. And that meant reaching the control panel, taking down the heart of this operation. But with Sarah distracted by her brother, the plan seemed nearly impossible. "John, can you hack into the security system?" Clint called out, his voice steady despite the escalating danger. John was already ahead of him, his fingers flying across his device. "Almost there. Just need a little more time." "Time is something we don't have," Clint muttered. The guards were pressing harder now, pushing them back, and the tight confines of the server room were only amplifying the danger. Clint's thoughts raced. There had to be another way. Something they weren't seeing. He glanced over at Sarah again, she was still firing, still holding her ground. But the look in her eyes when she saw Michael, the pain there, it was a vulnerability they couldn't afford right now. It was then that Clint noticed it, a faint glow on one of the side monitors, a code, running rapidly across the screen. It wasn't part of the standard security protocol. It was a message. Clint's heart skipped. It was a message from the inside. He sprinted to the control panel, ducking behind a row of servers, narrowly dodging a bullet. John's voice echoed in his ear. "Clint, you can't get to it, there are too many guards." But Clint was already moving. There was something he needed to see. He had to. He slid into the space beneath the main control station, his eyes focused on the encrypted data scrolling on the monitor. His fingers moved quickly, trying to decipher the code. It was hidden, buried beneath layers of encryption. But Clint had learned to read the battlefield, and now, he read the code. There it was, a pattern. A signal. A fail-safe. He had found it. "John!" Clint shouted, his voice urgent. "Get to the secondary console. There's a fail-safe switch in the system. We can overload the power grid. It'll disable the whole facility." John cursed under his breath, but Clint could hear him moving. Every second counted. Meanwhile, Sarah was still fighting, shooting, reloading, firing again. She was desperate now. The battle was raging in every corner, and every bullet was another step closer to disaster. But Clint knew what he had to do. The power grid, if they could overload it, they would cripple Crane's operation. But there was a catch. If they triggered the overload, the entire compound would go dark. That meant the guards would lose their advantage, but it also meant they wouldn't have any backup if something went wrong. It was a risk they had no choice but to take. "Clint." Sarah's voice cracked through the gunfire. "Michael. I can't just leave him here." "I know," Clint replied, his voice soft but firm. "But if we don't stop Crane, we won't be able to save anyone. Including him." Clint could see the anguish in Sarah's eyes as she looked back at Michael. Her brother was still watching her, his face filled with desperation. Sarah bit her lip, her weapon shaking. She wanted to run to him. She wanted to save him. But she knew that if they didn't take action now, they would all be lost. "Clint, I'm trusting you," Sarah said, her voice low but resolute. "Do it." Clint gave a sharp nod. "Now, John." John's fingers flew across the console as Clint's heart beat faster, counting the seconds. The facility trembled under the weight of the power surge, the lights flickering as the alarms grew louder. And then, the entire building plunged into darkness. A few seconds of absolute silence. Then, chaos erupted. The facility's power grid had overloaded. The lights were out. The guards had lost their advantage, their vision no longer enhanced by the lighting system. But the team was blind too. It was a mad scramble in the darkness as Clint and his team took advantage of the momentary chaos. In that instant, Clint grabbed Sarah's arm. "We've got one shot. Let's take it." They moved, fast and determined, weaving through the darkness, avoiding enemy fire, and heading straight for the door. Michael was still trapped, but there was no more time to waste. They had to go, or they would never get another chance. And as the team made their way toward the exit, the weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. The fight wasn't over yet. They had one goal now: take down Crane, and take back control. The world was plunged into darkness. The harsh blaring of alarms was muted by the absence of the lights, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and the distant echo of clattering metal. It was a disorienting moment, a pause before the storm. The team moved quickly, their movements swift and calculated, their eyes straining to make out anything in the pitch-black corridors. They were in a race against time now. Every second that passed, they knew, could mean the difference between success and failure. Clint's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Sarah had stayed close to him, her focus still on her brother, though the tension was evident in the way she gripped her weapon. She wasn't sure whether Michael could be saved or if it was already too late. What was the point of saving a brother who had already become something else? But she wouldn't leave him behind. Clint knew that. He also knew they didn't have time for emotional uncertainty. "Stay close," Clint whispered, keeping his voice low but firm. His hand gripped his own weapon tightly as he guided Sarah through the darkness. "We need to move fast. The longer we stay here, the worse it gets." Sarah nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. "I know," she said, her voice tinged with determination. "But if we don't get him?" "We will," Clint assured her, though his heart wasn't quite as certain as his words. He wanted to believe they could save Michael. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, not just for Michael, but for all of them. John was already ahead of them, moving through the dark with a kind of precision that came from years of experience. "We're almost there," John said, his voice barely audible above the ringing in their ears. "I found the central command room. If we can get in there and take control of the system, we might be able to stop Crane before he can launch his full operation." Clint gave a sharp nod. "Lead the way," he said, pushing past the swirling doubts that threatened to pull him under. There wasn't room for hesitation now. They moved as a unit, their steps synchronized, each of them hyper-aware of the danger that lingered just beyond the corners. Every hallway felt like a maze, twisting and turning, each space filled with the possibility of an ambush. But they had no choice but to push forward. The deeper they went into the facility, the more they felt the weight of their situation pressing down on them. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in, the air growing thicker with every step. The faint hum of the emergency generators in the background was the only sound that reminded them they weren't completely alone. Finally, they reached the central command room, a massive steel door standing in their way. Clint wasted no time, motioning for John to take the lead. "Get us in," Clint said, his voice urgent. John wasted no time with pleasantries. His fingers were already flying over his tablet, bypassing the encrypted locks one after another. It was a skill that Clint had come to rely on, and he didn't doubt that John could crack it. The seconds ticked by, each one a lifetime. But Clint could feel it in his bones, this was the moment. Finally, with a quiet click, the door slid open, and the team was inside. The control room was vast, filled with rows of terminals and monitors flashing with data. In the center of the room, Elias Crane stood, a calm expression on his face as if the entire world hadn't just descended into chaos. "Did you really think this would work, Clint?" Crane's voice was smooth, almost amused. He didn't even look up from the screen in front of him. Clint's fingers curled into fists. "You're done, Crane. This ends now." Crane finally turned his gaze toward them, a twisted smile forming on his lips. "Oh, I don't think you quite understand, Clint. This isn't a game you can win. This is the beginning of something far larger. You're too late." Clint's eyes flicked to the monitor where Crane had been working. The flashing lights told him everything he needed to know, the countdown had begun. They weren't just racing against time now, they were racing against a much bigger threat. "Stop it!" Sarah shouted, her voice desperate. You have no idea what you're doing. Crane chuckled, his eyes never leaving hers. Oh, but I do, Sarah. I know exactly what I'm doing. And soon, you'll all see the truth. All of you have been pawns in a much larger game. You've been chasing shadows. Clint's pulse quickened as he looked around the room. The countdown continued, ticking down relentlessly. They didn't have much time left before the system was fully operational. He glanced at John, who was already working frantically at one of the terminals. John, any luck? Clint asked, his voice tight with tension. I'm trying to override the system, but it's locked down tight, John replied, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. It's not just security, this is beyond anything I've seen. Crane's got a backdoor system running that we can't crack without pulling the plug entirely. Do it, Clint said, his voice calm, though his heart was anything but. Pull the plug. Now. John hesitated for a fraction of a second, his fingers hovering over the keys. You sure? Do it, Clint repeated, a finality in his voice. There was no room for doubt. John nodded and pressed a series of keys. The room around them trembled slightly, and the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, nothing. The monitors went black. The air in the room went still. Did we do it? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clint could feel his pulse in his throat, his mind spinning. It was over. They had done it. But there was still one thing left to settle. One thing that couldn't be ignored. The sound of slow clapping echoed through the room. Clint turned to see Crane standing there, his smile wide. Bravo! You've managed to delay the inevitable. But do you really think you've stopped me? Do you? Clint's blood ran cold. He should have known it was never going to be this easy. Why don't you ask your brother? Crane said, pointing toward Michael, who had been silently watching the scene unfold. I think he might have some answers. Sarah's gaze snapped to her brother. His eyes were empty, cold. And then, in the faint light, she saw it. A subtle but unmistakable shift in his posture, he wasn't as helpless as he appeared. Michael? Sarah said, her voice trembling. Michael didn't answer. Instead, he slowly reached for the gun holstered at his side. The gunshot echoed through the control room, sending a jolt of terror through Clint's chest. He had only a split second to react. The adrenaline surged as his body instinctively moved to shield Sarah. Every instinct told him to act fast, to make the decision that would secure their survival, but it felt wrong, he couldn't bring himself to hurt Michael. Move, move, move. Clint yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. He pushed Sarah toward the door, his hand gripping her arm as they sprinted away from Michael, the dangerous, cold stare in his eyes following them like a predator. They darted through the hallways of the facility, their footsteps pounding against the concrete floor, each echo amplifying the urgency of their escape. Clint's mind raced, trying to calculate the next step. John had already cleared the access doors, but that wasn't enough. They needed to get out of the facility entirely, and they needed to do it fast. John! Clint shouted as they rounded a corner. How much further? We're almost there, John called back from ahead, his voice barely audible over the sounds of their frantic escape. Just a little more. Clint's breath was ragged. His lungs burned with the effort, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Sarah was still with him, but her steps seemed slower, more reluctant. Every time she glanced back, Clint saw that flicker of pain in her eyes. She wasn't just running to survive, she was running from losing Michael, from watching him slip further and further away into whatever darkness Crane had created. He didn't blame her. They had both known the brother that Michael used to be. They had both loved him. But the man Michael had become, that wasn't Michael anymore. Clint had to keep reminding himself of that, even as his heart twisted with the weight of it all. Suddenly, a deafening explosion rocked the building, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. Clint almost lost his balance, his body thrown off course. But instinctively, he grabbed Sarah, pulling her back to her feet, even as a blast of debris rained down around them. "Get down!" Clint shouted. They ducked behind a column just in time as the sound of shattering glass and crumbling concrete filled the air. A thick cloud of dust enveloped them, blinding them for a moment. "John!" Clint called again, his voice hoarse. "I'm here," came the reply, but it was strained, distant. The explosion, it triggered the whole structure's failsafe. The whole facility's going to collapse. Clint's heart skipped a beat. They didn't have time. If they didn't make it out soon, the entire facility would become their tomb. "Come on!" Clint shouted, pulling Sarah forward again. They moved through the dust, the heat and smoke in the air making it almost impossible to breathe. Sarah's hand was still clutched tightly in his, but it felt like she was slipping away. The weight of the moment was too much for her to carry. The finality of everything, of losing Michael, of watching the world unravel, was beginning to crush her. "Clint," Sarah's voice was faint, almost lost in the chaos. "I can't leave him. I can't leave Michael like this." Clint stopped dead in his tracks, turning to face her. Her eyes were wild with anguish, but there was something else there too, something deep and undeniable. It was the same pain he felt, the same crushing regret that they couldn't save him. "You're right. We can't leave him," Clint said, his voice firm, but his own heart betraying him. "But we can't save him now. Michael is gone. We've tried." "No." Sarah interrupted, shaking her head fiercely. "He's still my brother. There has to be a way." Clint's eyes softened, his throat tightening. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to tell her that Michael could still be saved. But the truth was too clear, Michael had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The man standing before them was a stranger. And it was the stranger who had pulled the trigger, who had aimed a weapon at them with cold calculation. Not the brother Sarah had known. "Sarah, I know this hurts," Clint said, his voice low and urgent. "But we have to live. We have to get out of here. If we stay, we'll end up like him." For a long moment, Sarah didn't answer. She simply stood there, frozen, her eyes distant as if lost in her thoughts. But then, slowly, she nodded. A small, almost imperceptible nod. "Okay," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Let's go." With that, they moved forward again, every step feeling like an eternity. The sound of the building's collapse reverberated louder now, as though the whole structure was groaning under its own weight. The countdown was still ticking away, its presence a constant reminder that they didn't have time to waste. As they neared the exit, they saw John, standing near the entrance, his hand on the emergency door release. "We're not gonna make it if we don't go now," he said urgently. Clint glanced over his shoulder. The hallway was beginning to buckle, large sections of the ceiling coming down, dust filling the air. "Move it!" Clint yelled. The trio pushed forward, breaking through the final barrier to the outside world. They were hit by the cool night air, the harsh contrast to the hellish heat of the facility. But even as they ran toward the distant line of trees marking the boundary of the compound, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they had only just begun to deal with the consequences of what had transpired. Crane was still out there. Michael was still lost. And the world was on the edge of something far worse than they'd ever imagined. As they reached the edge of the trees, Sarah stopped again, her eyes scanning the darkness behind them, as though expecting Michael to come running after them. Clint could see the pain etched in her face, the brokenness that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "We can't go back, Sarah," Clint said quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We did everything we could. We have to move forward now." But Sarah didn't reply. She only nodded once more, as if the weight of the decision had finally settled into her bones. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds the crunch of dry leaves beneath their feet and the occasional whisper of the wind through the trees. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for the chaos of the past few hours to settle. Clint, Sarah, and John had made it out. They were alive. But the weight of the events hung heavily over them. There was no sense of triumph in their survival, only the cold reality of what they had left behind. The sounds of the crumbling facility were still fresh in their minds, the explosion, the falling debris, the heat and smoke. It had felt like the end of everything. But now, as they trudged through the dark woods, the silence was deafening. Clint kept his pace steady, but his mind raced. Michael. The brother Sarah had once known, the man Clint had tried to reach, was now gone. His last words echoed in Clint's mind, "You'll never leave here alive." It wasn't just a threat, it was a twisted prophecy. Sarah walked beside him, but her gaze was distant, her eyes hollow. She had barely spoken since they left the facility, her silence more telling than any words could have been. The pain was visible on her face, etched deeply into her features. Clint's thoughts kept drifting back to that moment in the control room when Michael had raised the gun. Even as he had been ready to fight, he had hoped, even prayed, that he wouldn't have to make the call. But the gunshot had torn that hope to pieces. Michael wasn't coming back. Not the way they had wanted. Not the way Sarah had dreamed. They had lost him. But Clint couldn't allow himself to dwell on the loss. They still had a long road ahead, and Michael's fate wasn't their only concern. Crane was still out there, lurking in the shadows, and now they had to stop him before it was too late. Where to now? John's voice broke the silence, his question sharp and practical, as always. He had been the one to handle their escape route, guiding them through the woods, away from any remaining security forces that might be searching for them. Clint exhaled sharply. He had no answers. No solid plan. The mission had changed. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for something much bigger, the future. "We need to find out where Crane is," Clint said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "We need to stop him before this goes any further. He's the key to all of this." Sarah looked at Clint then, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she said nothing, but then she nodded. "I don't care where we go," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want this nightmare to end." Clint glanced at her, his heart heavy. The Sarah he had known, strong, fierce, and capable, was still there, but this new pain, this raw grief, was something he couldn't fix. He couldn't take away the pain of losing her brother. All he could do was stand by her and keep moving forward, no matter how broken they all felt. "We'll stop Crane," Clint said with quiet determination. "Together." John gave a short nod. "Then we'll need a plan, and fast. We're not the only ones looking for him. I don't know how long we have before he makes his next move." Clint felt the weight of John's words settle in. They couldn't afford to waste time. The three of them trudged on in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, until they finally reached a clearing in the woods. The moon hung high above them, casting a pale light over the landscape. They stopped, taking a moment to gather themselves. "Clint," Sarah spoke again, her voice breaking the stillness. "What if it's too late? What if Michael, what if we can't stop any of this?" Clint turned to her, his expression softening. "It's never too late, Sarah. We still have a chance. We have each other, and that's enough to keep fighting." But Sarah didn't seem convinced. She looked away, her face clouded with doubt. The grief in her eyes wasn't something Clint could easily soothe. It was something she had to carry with her, whether she wanted to or not. Suddenly, John's voice cut through the air, his tone urgent. "Guys, we've got company." Clint spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but before he could react, he saw them, three figures emerging from the shadows. At first, Clint thought they might be enemies, more of Crane's men. But as they stepped into the light, Clint recognized them. "Mark?" Clint said, his voice filled with surprise. The tall, broad-shouldered figure who stepped forward was none other than Mark Reynolds, an old friend from Clint's days in the Secret Service. Behind him were two other agents, faces Clint didn't recognize but who looked equally determined. "We thought you were dead," Clint added, his voice thick with disbelief. Mark gave a grim smile. "Funny. I thought the same about you." Mark's gaze flickered to Sarah, then to John. "You're lucky we found you. The whole place is crawling with Crane's people. We need to move, now." Clint nodded, his mind still reeling from the unexpected reunion. Mark's sudden appearance was a relief, but it also brought more questions. How had he survived? How had they found them? "Where's the rest of your team?" Clint asked, his suspicion rising. "They didn't make it," Mark replied. His face hardened as he spoke, a reminder that even the most well-prepared could fall in the line of duty. "We were tracking Crane's movements, but when the facility went down, we lost contact. We've been moving underground ever since." Clint took in the information, the pieces of the puzzle slowly starting to fit together. Mark and his team had been working on the same mission, stopping Crane, but they had been forced into hiding after the explosion. "All right," Clint said, his mind shifting into action. "We need to regroup. We can't waste any more time. What's the plan?" Mark's eyes darkened. "Crane's operations are scattered across multiple safehouses, but we think we know where he's headed next. If we get there before him, we might have a shot at taking him down." Clint turned to Sarah and John, his mind racing with possibilities. The endgame was in sight, but it wouldn't be easy. Not with what they had lost and what they were about to face. "Let's move," Clint said, his voice steady. "We don't have much time." With Mark and his team now in the fold, the hunt for Crane intensified. The journey was far from over, but with every step forward, they could feel the weight of the past giving way to something new, a final chance for redemption. But would it be enough to stop Crane? Would they finally bring him to justice, or would the cost of their survival be even greater than they could imagine? As the group moved deeper into the forest, ready for whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain, the end was drawing closer. And the battle for their lives, and for the future, was about to take its final, fateful turn. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?